Welcome to the Fresh Vending Podcast, where we discuss how smart vending machines are revolutionizing fresh food accessibility for both creators and consumers.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 9 of the Fresh Vending Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by Isaac today.
Hi everyone.
And what we want to talk about today is the correlation between having high quality fresh food and your cognitive performance, and kind of how those two things are proven to have a strong relationship. Just kind of stepping in, we talked about this in earlier episodes. So my background is when I was in my late teens and through my 20s, I was a professional chef and entrepreneur, and then I've been in food technology companies the last 15 years. And the common thread between those companies is how do we use technology to make fresh food more accessible to people at all times across the socioeconomic spectrum. Isaac, I think your background is very well tailored for this conversation today. Can you share a little bit about your background and kind of how that is relevant to the discussion?
Yeah, I spent a lot of my adult life studying the brain. That was my undergraduate degree, and that kind of led into personal study of brain health and optimizing performance, both physically and mentally. And now I'm looking into kind of the food system, the economics of the food system, and how that influences decision-making around food, which of course influences your health. So that's kind of my background and my reason for being so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit. So undergrad in neuroscience, and then currently working on sustainable agriculture degree with an emphasis on aquaculture. Cornerstone to the conversation, what are the components of a healthy diet? Just kind of kicking it off to be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, so there's 4. The first one is variety, the second one is adequacy, the third one is balance, and the fourth one is moderation. And this essentially can be split up into 2 things, which is quality and quantity, really. You want a variety of different foods. You want enough of those foods. You don't want too much of one or the other. And that's kind of those are the pillars of a healthy diet.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about, like, when you were going through that, you kind of self-reflect and think about my own diet with variety, adequacy, balance, and moderation, and kind of what I intentionally make. I work from home, so what I intentionally make available to myself at home to kind of help guide those good decisions on a daily basis. I think I've heard many times that we tend to be much more idealistic with our future self and say, like, oh, it's, I'm gonna exercise this much and I'm gonna eat these foods, and whereas in the moment, I think when we're left to our own devices, people tend to make less than optimal decisions for health. So I definitely fall into that category when I go grocery shopping, be much more ideal with my future self. What are some things that you've seen in your firsthand experiences and with your educational background that, like, really drives that decision making on a daily basis or weekly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with nutrition, especially when talking about nutrition, we obviously need to make the disclaimer that everyone is so different, and nutrition is one of the most debated topics online, arguably one of the most controversial topics, because you can have someone that can cite 5 studies saying that eating meat is great for them, and anecdotally it has been great for them and they've been healed of all these diseases. And then on the other side, someone that's only eaten plants, and they can cite all these studies and say, this is, I was healed of my eczema from eating all plants. It just can go on and on, right? And so it's really important for everyone to be a scientist with their own life and their own body, right? And so I've done things where I hear about how eating every 2 hours is great for energy, so I'll eat every 2 hours. I've had a year when I only did 1 meal a day because I learned about kind of ketosis and how that's good for longevity in terms of fasting and cell regeneration and things like that. And then now I'm kind of more in this, like, 4-hour feeding window and not eating too many processed foods. So you just kind of figure out what works for you. But for me, it's just been the scientific studies really that's driving my decision making, and constantly learning. And that's the thing about science that people don't understand, Nathan, is that they think when a paper comes out, it's end all be all. Let's just do that and not update our perceptions. But science, by definition, is always going to be improving, and we need to continue to look at it. But I mean, the research around how nutrition affects cognitive performance is clear and is continuing, of course. And regardless of when you eat, or if you fast or you don't, or if you eat breakfast or not, or what kind of foods you eat, the literature clearly shows that a quality diet is going to contribute to higher cognitive performance. Should we get into some of these studies?
Yeah, I think that as you were talking, it just kind of I really wanted to highlight that kind of be your own scientist comment. I think that was, if there was one or two takeaways that people could have from this podcast, I think you really touched on something special there. As humans, we always want to have like a buttoned up answer, especially if it serves our own opinion, right? So you're talking about finding those research papers that kind of feed into our belief system. It's funny. It did bring to mind, there was a comedian, George Burns, and I think he was around 90 years old when he said this. And he was one of those guys that he just always had a cigar in his hand. And he would say, "Oh, what's your secret to longevity?" And he's like, bacon and cigars. And for, I think, a lot of people, if they lived his lifestyle, they might have made it into their 70s. But for him and the way his body was made and his kind of constitution, he obviously liked bacon and cigars, and it worked for him. And it's something that that was his formula, but obviously not everybody. So I thought that was kind of a perfect example of being your own scientist and figuring out that mix of what makes you happy versus if longevity is something that's incredibly important to you in your life, or if you prefer kind of something that's a little bit more decadent, just kind of aligning that with your values. What are some of the well, let me ask you this. You talked about maybe transitioning into talking about some publications out there. I'd love to hear a little bit about the information, but then also understand, like, why did you choose these particular publications, kind of knowing that that bias?
Yeah, I look at scientific studies all day. I'm a grad student, and so really what you want to look at is if it was in a peer-reviewed journal, or if it was a peer-reviewed article in a high-quality journal, rather. And you want to see how many times it was cited, because usually papers that are relevant and valid are cited more often. Not always, but that's been the case. And I searched generally for the phrase how nutrition affects cognitive performance, and that's kind of more of a in economics, there's positive versus normative, right? Positive is just making a general statement about, if oil prices go up, this is what happens to inflation. Normative statements are more like, oh, we should do this so that we can achieve this outcome, and it has more of an opinion behind it. But I try to search with more of a kind of a in this case, a capital P positive kind of sentiment, so that it's just giving me the data instead of biasing towards one way or another. So in terms of where the studies came from, that's kind of what I used to choose the studies. So I mean, looking at the first one, this is a literature review. This is in 2005 by Taras et al. And this looked at a plethora of different studies that looked at nutrition versus food performance. This is what literature reviews do, and they can be very useful when you're introduced into a topic like this. What they found, well, their main findings were micronutrient deficiency decreases academic performance, especially iron. And within their review, the papers that looked at kind of iron deficiency therapy in finding school-age children in this case that had iron deficiency, and helping them get back that level back up to recommended amounts, their academic performance improved actually. And the second kind of main finding was that breakfast programs, like introducing a breakfast program in a school, that increased academic performance for severely undernourished populations, but not necessarily for populations that were doing okay in terms of nutrition. So that's just kind of a clear flag that says if you're not eating enough and you start eating enough, you're going to do better in school.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's so many programs out there, and I think in some senses this is one of those topics that's like you could sit down and talk to somebody about it and say, yeah, like that makes complete sense. Like it's not a surprise to me at all. But then you look at it in practice in the United States, and there's a lot of things that we do that are totally counter to that sensibility, which I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's pretty obvious. You're not telling me anything new here. And I know, I think about certain things like, there's vast implementation of like these breakfast programs in school, right? There's things like that have happened in the last, I think, 20 years that are great to see. But also, I mean, if you go into, I've been in the emergency room twice in the last year, not for myself, but for a family member. And, you get in there and you're walking around at 10 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night. You can't get hours when, depending on where you are, you can't get food delivery anymore. And you start looking around and you're like, where, the best thing that you can find is maybe a Hot Pocket or, something that's like salty sweet out of a vending machine. And you start really scratching your head and saying, man, I don't have access to this, but what about the person that's giving care to my family member? Like, I hope that, they packed a high quality lunch or whatever it may be. You start to think about these things when you see in practice that we're not following through. And I just brought up the hospital example because I'm thinking to myself, if there's anywhere in the entire world that we should have high quality nutrition, it's probably that environment. And then also for the people that are visiting who are under a ton of stress, but for the people that are giving care, they should always have options there to make sure that they're at their cognitive best. Again, just kind of throwing out a couple examples of my personal experiences and how I've seen this play out. So where does that take us? Or was there other research that you saw that you kind of felt added to that conversation?
Yeah, so it's really important to look at individual experiments as well as literature reviews. So I found a couple. One was in school-age children in Korea. This came et al. In 2003, cited a lot in these kind of themed studies here. But they administered a questionnaire to these students, and that questionnaire essentially measured their food frequency score, so how often they were eating, among other things. And after that, they measured these kids' academic performance through GPA and other metrics throughout the year. And those that had a higher food frequency score, those that ate regular meals, had increased academic performance. And it's important to note that these are observational studies, right? So we can't conclude causation, but they saw strong correlation here, and they even controlled for the parent's socioeconomic status, right? And for those that are kind of new to this language, oftentimes when you're doing these observational studies, right, you see this, a child has had regular meals, and so they did better in school. Boom, that one causes the other. Well, not necessarily, right? Because a child that has regular meals most likely has parents that have good jobs, who most likely have good education, who most likely, were able to bring up their child in a kind of more intellectually stimulating environment. You can go on, but those are all confounding variables, what we call confounding variables. And if you don't control for them, then they can muddy up your interpretation of these results. So even when they controlled for those things, in other words, they took the influence of those things out of the model,
Mm-hmm.
they still found that regular meals were associated with increased academic performance. So that was quite an interesting study that's been cited a lot. Kim et al. 2003.
Yeah, I really, yeah, it's really important that you touched on that, because I think that really kind of helps if it's, it really helps kind of distill down and drive the point home, right? Because it is so indicative of other things that's happening in the home. Are there any other like common themes that you saw as you were, kind of doing this research?
Right. Yeah. And I guess I should correct myself. I said when they took those confounding variables out of the model, what I meant is they included them into the model, so they each had their own effect, and they could tease out the separate ones. There's one more I wanted to talk about, Nathan, and this one was in Canadian school-aged children, and they looked at diet quality. So not just, before we were looking at frequency, but they're looking at quality, which they took this measure of diet quality index, DQI, and the kind of variables they looked at to evaluate DQI was fruit and vegetable intake as a percentage of caloric intake from dietary fat. And they looked at variety and adequacy. The kids that had a higher diet quality index, aka the ones that ate more fruits and vegetables, had a higher performance on the literacy test. So that's just, to tie it all together, right? Breakfast, regular meals, and high fruit and vegetable and other high quality fresh food intake increases academic performance, because we're talking about school-age children, but one can probably safely translate that into performance of a surgeon at a hospital, or a worker at a workplace, college student in the university. So those were kind of are the big takeaways that I found from the literature.
Yeah, it's I know that I've seen studies from Harvard, for example, and I'm not going to cite it as well as you have, but something that I read about a year ago, and it was talking about same thing, direct correlation of GPA to their student nutrition. And I love the fact that it's stepping into not just did you have a meal, but what is the actual nutritional value, because that's what really matters at the end of the day. I know that also, like with companies like I talk about this frequently, like tech companies in the Bay Area, when they started offering food as an amenity in the early 2000s, and it really took off. A big part of that was that their employees were never distracted, but they were also taking these really smart people and eliminating all of the variables to make sure that fuel is never an issue, being the food that they put in their bodies, to make sure that they're always operating optimally. So it's something that, at face value, it looked like a really nice amenity that they were giving to their employees. But the reality is that it was that, and also a really savvy business move to make sure that thinking about food, having access to high quality food was never an issue. And that, productivity and time spent with kind of optimal brain power was there. So I think it's, just kind of throwing out some more anecdotal examples of how that's played out in higher education, as well as, some businesses that are making some pretty savvy moves with their workforce.
Yeah, that's great. I think, given that we're talking about, this third wave vending wave of just new technologies, I really feel like these solutions are hugely important in terms of getting high quality nutrition to people around the clock, especially with smart fridges. And, that kind of solves the problem of accessibility, especially when you're looking at, if you're a student, what's available around the clock. And most of the time, it's not much, unless you're looking at sweet, salty, and shelf stable. So smart fridges can really bring this high quality nutrition to the table in all of these locations around the clock.
Yeah, and it's also like hearing as we're talking about this, and I think well, you look at the examples, right, of somebody that it kind of how this generationally, this food insecurity or lack of quality nutrition follows them from, maybe they're growing up in an inner city neighborhood where you walk around the neighborhood and it's fast food places, corner stores, and the restaurants around that the community runs, not always, but quite often can be food that's not the healthiest. Maybe it's fried food and high fatty food and things of that nature. And then, if you go to school and you're on a partial scholarship or a full scholarship, for you can have a subsidized meal plan, but for half the day you don't have access to high quality food and it follows you there. And if you don't go to university, and you're going and working in a manufacturing plant or something like that, you have a vending machine and maybe the taco truck pulls up once a day. So it's something that's, just to be clear, we're not just talking about this idealistic university or, white collar workplace. It's something that, across the board, I think the place that we can make the biggest impact with these types of technologies are for those individuals that have been kind of trapped into this generational poverty or access that's systemic in the United States. It's like the system is created all this and perpetuates all this. So it's really exciting to talk about these things, and then to talk about how do we kind of make improvements in the current workplaces, but also look into the future and say, how many years is it going to take us until we can start to make massive foundational shifts in the way that this technology is applied, with partnerships like the USDA, for example, to be able to make these changes for all Americans, and not just those that are working in the white collar companies, or those that are graduating from the top universities, or those that can afford to hop on a plane to take a vacation or something like that. So I think for us, it's really exciting to see short-term applications versus the long-term opportunity.
Yeah, it's beautiful how this kind of fits together like a puzzle. I mean, if you look at the economic foundations of food, or kind of the pillars of the microeconomics of food and health, you have the budget food relationship, where what you buy depends on how much money you have and the price of the food. That can be integrated with smart fridges, because say if I'm a company or a factory, I can offer subsidies to workers there. You have the preference food relationship, where you're going to buy what you want or what you like to eat, again with variety. Before, kind of, if folks listen to our last episode, we talked about kind of the first vending machines and how they were very limited on what they can sell. Now with these third wave vending solutions, your opportunities are just opened up so widely on what you can sell, from anything like a refrigerated protein bar to a sushi bowl, or to a sushi roll to a quinoa bowl, anything. So preference food, that's fits well into this smart fridge model. Of course, you have the food nutrient relationship, where you get the nutrients that are in the food you eat. Again, high quality fresh food can be sold through these third wave vending solutions. You have the nutrient health relationship, where the nutrients you eat influence your health in certain ways. And then importantly, you have the accessibility food relationship. So you can like food, you can want to buy food, you can have the money for it or subsidy for it, but if it's not available, if there's no open restaurants near you, you're just not going to get that food. You're not going to get that nutrition. You're not going to get that health. So the smart fridge and other third wave vending solutions can really do some wonders for this side and this sector of our societal focus, which is how we can improve health outcomes through food.
Yeah, thanks for walking through those different choices, because I think it's really important to be cognizant of that. It kind of like came back to what I was talking about earlier in the episode, where I said, okay, I'm going to go grocery shopping for myself, especially during the weekdays, and make sure that I'm making good choices in advance, so that I kind of pigeonhole myself into only having healthy food options, which makes it easy in the moment when I'm on autopilot. But it's really good to be aware of that. And I think that, our philosophy, and something that Isaac and I have talked about many times and that we share, is that, there's nothing wrong with eating chocolate cake or a Snickers bar or whatever it may be, with moderation. But what we want to do, and what we're excited about, and what I was alluding to earlier about whether it's what we can do in an airport tomorrow or what we can do, in an inner city neighborhood, something on a large systemic scale like a USDA partnership down the road, is that we can make sure that high quality fresh food is always a choice. You're not going to say yes to it every single time, but we almost feel like it's a human right that you always have access to high quality fresh food, especially in a country like the United States, where we don't have a shortage of high quality fresh food available. It's more so a distribution challenge. So looking forward and saying, how do we solve that puzzle? Because that's super meaningful. And it's something that you can, get out of bed in the morning and feel excited about tackling a little piece of that big problem every single day. But I think it's, in closing, Isaac, thank you for all the research and really kind of sharing. We can put that in links to all this in the show notes of what Isaac cited during the episode. If you want to dive a little bit deeper and kind of evolve your own understanding of how high quality fresh food really levels the playing field for learning, performing, whether it's in athletics or an academic environment or in a work environment, it's something that we as a culture really need to take big steps towards leveling that playing field. And the good news is that the tools to do that are now right at our fingertips. So thanks again for joining us this episode, and we will look forward to bringing you more on the next episode. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the show this week. If you're interested in learning more about smart vending platforms, you can visit us at launchfoodspot.com. I'm Nathan Downs, and you've been listening to the Fresh Vending Podcast.